It was a cool early spring day in the mid to late 1990s when I first happened upon Keith Haring's Pop Shop. My mom had a work meeting in New York City, and my brother and I were on break from school, so we took the train down from Albany, and while Mom was in a meeting, Richard and I spent a couple hours wandering around Greenwich Village and Soho. As we walked down Lafayette Street, we saw a store with a bright yellow awning that said Pop Shop, the words surrounded by rows of radiant babies like you saw earlier. The interior of the store was painted floor to ceiling, including the floor and the ceiling, with bold black and white lines by the artist himself. Now, even if you have no idea who Keith Haring is, you are likely familiar with some of his art. The radiant baby, the barking dog, the dancing and intertwined human figures, and the people holding up big red hearts. These have all become iconic symbols. And so it was for me. I didn't know anything about Keith Haring, but I knew his art. So we stopped at the store, marveled at all the bright, colorful items for sale, and walked away with a couple tiny buttons on our backpacks. This is exactly why Keith Haring opened the Pop Shop in 1986. In his words, I wanted to attract a wide range of people, and I wanted it to be a place where not only collectors could come, but also kids from the Bronx, or a couple of kids from upstate New York. From 1986 until it closed in 2005, the Pop Shop was a place that anyone could go to get to know and appreciate Keith Haring's work. It was a store, but it was also a museum, and the items for sale were affordable. Keith Haring has been one of my favorite artists ever since, and the more I learn about his life, the more I'm inspired. I hope that you will leave church today inspired by him as well. He's an artist who inspires in many ways, but he had his own inspirations as well. First and foremost was his father, Alan Haring, an engineer and amateur cartoonist. Before Keith was even a year old, he sat on his father's lap and they would scribble with crayons together. When he got a little bit older, his father taught him how to draw circles, and then he'd make the circle into a balloon or an ice cream cone or a face or an animal. Other times, Alan would draw a line and then ask Keith to draw a line, and then Alan would add another line and make something out of it, kind of like you all did earlier. These simple line drawings that he did while sitting on his dad's lap inspired his later style of art, characterized by big, bold lines. You can also see his childhood love of Walt Disney, Dr. Seuss, and Charles Schulz in the art that he created as an adult. When he graduated high school, he left his hometown of Kutztown, Pennsylvania, and went to art school in Pittsburgh and then New York City. He discovered artists in whom he saw parts of himself. Robert Henri's idea of what it means to be an artist and a teacher, Jean Dubuffet's abstract interconnected shapes, the bold and colorful style of Stuart Davis, the way Pierre Alechinsky and Jackson Pollock embraced the drips of paint and incorporated them into their art, and the collaborative public art pieces of Christo and Jean-Claude. He connected with Andy Warhol, who became a mentor. He met and became good friends with Jean-Michel Basquiat when he let Basquiat into the School of Visual Arts one day, not knowing who he was, only to find later that he had covered several walls of the school with graffiti. Keith said, "Each of those painters had something I was involved with, so I investigated them, trying to find out who they were so I could figure out who I was and where I was coming from." Seeing himself in these artists gave him tremendous confidence. And although he was profoundly influenced by many artists who came before him, he did not copy what they did. Keith Haring explored where he came from so that he could figure out who he was and to define and refine his distinct style. One of Keith Haring's core beliefs, and a value that guided his entire career, was that art is for everybody. Before anyone knew who he was and before he opened the pop shop to connect with a broad audience, his gallery was the New York City subway. He noticed the unused advertising panels covered with matte black paper in the subway stations, and he began drawing on them with white chalk. Between 1980 and 1985, he made thousands of these public drawings, sometimes as many as 40 in one day. While he did engage with people who stopped to watch him work, he drew very quickly. It comes out fast, but it's a fast-moving world, he said. He wasn't always fast enough to avoid getting caught and was arrested multiple times, including one time documented by CBS News. Keith was criticized by much of the New York City art establishment of his time because he went right to the people, working in the streets, allowing anyone and everyone to experience his work, rather than trying to garner acceptance by the art world first and letting his success trickle down. Yoko Ono once said, "Keith has always stood outside the art world because his art is the people's art." He did, with time, gain wider recognition. During his brief career, which spanned the 1980s and ended with his death from AIDS-related illness in February of 1990, he was featured in over 100 solo and group exhibitions and traveled the world creating over 50 large-scale public murals on hospitals and schools and churches, and even on a section of the Berlin Wall. Many of his murals were commissioned, but one that was not commissioned was his famous 1986 Crack is Whack mural in East Harlem, visible from the heavily traveled FDR Drive. As Keith did many times in his art, he was responding to the issues of his time, in this case, the crack cocaine epidemic. He was arrested for vandalism immediately after creating the mural, but after the media picked up his story, he was released on a lesser charge. Ultimately, the mural remained and has been preserved to this day. Keith Haring believed that art and beauty are not and should not be something reserved for a small elite. They are something that all of us can both create and enjoy. You don't have to know anything about art to appreciate it, he explained in a CBS News interview. He said about his art, there aren't any hidden secrets or things that you're supposed to understand. You look at his artwork and the symbols that he returned to again and again, and you see him. You see the world in which he lived, and you see the human experience. Keith Haring adopted the radiant baby as his signature because he said it is the purest form of human experience. One project that remained unrealized upon his early death was conceived for Tama City, Japan. All of its residents between the ages of 6 and 18 would hold up mirrors that when seen aerially by plane or satellite would form a giant radiant baby. Then the project would expand to other parts of the world with children doing the same thing. My baby would actually crawl around the entire globe, he mused. But his enthusiasm for the project was not about himself. It was about the symbolism. Children are the bearers of life in its simplest and most joyous form, he said. Keith himself had a childlike spirit. He had an openness, a sense of wonder, an energy with which he approached people and any blank wall or canvas. This spirit helped him to connect with children of all ages around the world through his art, which was very direct and communicated emotions that all of us are familiar with. He said, "I found out that I can make any kid smile. It's probably from having a funny face to begin with and looking and acting like a kid. And kids can relate to my drawings because of the simple lines. So whenever I can," he said, "I do projects with kids." The City Kids Speak on Liberty project that I mentioned in the story earlier was perhaps the grandest example of Keith's public art with children. In 1986, on the 100th anniversary of the Statue of Liberty, he was commissioned to create this 10-story tall banner involving over 1,000 children and teens from around New York City. They used the Javits Convention Center because it was the only space large enough to lay it out on the floor. Keith made the black outlines, you can see here, and the kids drew, painted, and wrote within the outlines, sharing their thoughts on liberty and freedom. It was a very large banner, but even so, not every kid could work on it at the same time. There were groups of about 50 kids working on it in 45-minute intervals. And while not working on the banner, the kids played games about liberty and were entertained by performers ranging from New Kids on the Block to Philip Glass to Herbie Hancock. Keith attributes his love of working with kids to his family, his father, Alan, and his youngest sister, Kristen, in particular. He was 12 years old when Kristen was born, but of his 3 sisters, he was closest to her. I loved teaching her things and being with her and being sensitive to her, he said. Whatever else I am, he wrote in a 1987 journal entry, I'm sure I at least have been a good companion to a lot of children and taught them a kind of simple lesson of sharing and caring. At the height of his career, Keith was diagnosed with AIDS. He knew that he was a likely candidate. When not making art, he spent much of his time dancing in clubs and all that came along with that. Numerous friends and acquaintances, including a former partner, had already succumbed to the disease when he discovered the purple spot, a Kaposi sarcoma, on his leg in 1988. He worried when his AIDS diagnosis became public that it would block him from continuing to work with kids because of the fear and stigma surrounding the disease. But he continued speaking up, getting people's attention with his art, and sometimes shocking audiences with his visual truth-telling and provocative celebration of the body and human dignity. He became an artistic activist for safe sex and HIV/AIDS awareness. Silence Equals Death was the title of one of his most famous pieces of this time. His diagnosis with AIDS coincided with the 20th anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising, when the Stonewall Inn in New York was raided by police and the uprising, led by trans women and drag queens of color, kicked off what was known as the gay liberation movement. Today we know it as Pride. And we celebrate this month, and today in particular, as June 28th is the 54th anniversary of the uprising. In addition to continuing to create art along these lines, in 1989, he established the Keith Haring Foundation to provide funding and imagery for AIDS organizations and children's programs. Today, the foundation continues to provide grants and funding to nonprofits focusing on youth and HIV/AIDS education. Timothy Leary, yes, the advocate of psychedelic drugs, wrote about Keith Haring. He said, I must say that Keith may be controversial, but nobody really dislikes him. He may be shocking, subversive, offensive, but they all love him. Now, I'm not going into the most shocking and subversive material here in this sermon, but you can Google if you're not familiar. Keith Haring had a gift, though. He was provocative but loved, provocative but loving. And this is something that I think can inspire us all. You know those provocative people who are really hard to like? Yeah, I see some nods. I'm sure I'm not the only one who has encountered them. That wasn't Keith. He was loved and loving because even as he created things that were controversial, he did so in a way that drew people in and built connections. He did so in a way that made people smile or that connected with them on a deeply human level. His journals, which were published posthumously, reveal this about him. One of my favorite lines in those journals was, I live every day as if it were the last. I love life, he wrote in caps. I love babies and children, and some people, most people, well, maybe not most, but a lot of people. But it wasn't just his journals that revealed who Keith Haring was. It was his actions, too. His sister Kay, speaking to over 1,000 people at his memorial service, said, "It has always seemed to me that the brother I grew up with is the same brother that all of you know. Only the neighborhood get-together became the Manhattan club scene. The art projects with kids grew to include thousands and thousands of youths. His generous nature reached to touch virtually millions, and the canvas on which he drew became the whole world. I learned a lot from my big brother," she said, "that a wall was meant to be drawn on, a Saturday night was meant for partying, and that life is meant for celebrating. Keith showed me that it is possible to live what you believe." I love that. It is possible to live what you believe. And as religious people, as Unitarian Universalists, it is vital for us to live what we believe and to draw on these beliefs as we respond to the world around us, just as Keith Haring responded to the critical issues of his time. He viewed the role of the artist as one who liberates the soul, provokes the imagination, encourages people to go further, and celebrates humanity instead of manipulating it. Religious community at its best does just that. Our medium is relationship with ourselves, with others, and with the holy. His medium was relationship as well. Relationships created through collaborative and public art. I think he would say we are all artists of the Spirit. He and we are artists of the Spirit in the way we see, acknowledge, and draw out the wisdom in others, both young and old. He and we are artists of the Spirit in the way that we respond to critical or controversial moments in a way that is open and that draws people in and builds connections. He and we are artists of the Spirit when we live life fully to the very end and support others in doing so as well. May the life and work of Keith Haring inspire you to live the truth that he held so dear, that art is for everybody, and everybody can create art. May it be so, and amen.